welcome back to the next edition of our podcast. I'm Jennie Mead, a fractional CHRO or CPO, depending on what you like to be called, and a partner at Giant London. Today, I have two very special guests with me. I have Matt Winter, who brings a wealth of experience in senior leadership roles in education, along with a master's in people and organisational development, and now as a consultant. Recently, he has been working as a social impact consultant, guiding businesses to become forces for good by tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges. Now, as a culture consultant, Matt helps individuals, teams, and leaders enhance their performance by defining and aligning with a clear, compelling organisational purpose. Welcome, Matt, to the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks, Jenny.
And also alongside Matt, we will have James Crouch. James, with nearly a decade of experience, is a talent acquisition specialist helping HR leaders, CTOs and founders build on onshore, offshore centres and rapidly scaling teams. Now at the Leadership Collective, James works closely with businesses to build and source key talents across various regions, both domestically and internationally. So welcome, James.
Thank you.
So Matt and James are very well placed to join this particular series in the podcast. And in particular, as we go in to talk about how do we scale people and think about how we scale that talent and the culture side of it. So I'm going to be looking at the talent acquisition piece first. So James, let's talk about it from this point of view. We are a founder and we've just received funding to be directed at hiring. Where do we start?
Going with the broad question to open it up, I guess. The answer to that is there's not a one-size-fits-all approach is the perspective that I would take. Obviously, it's crucial to identify, those key core roles. Anything in that side, especially when you're approaching growth, the 6 to 12 month period is a really important time. So you need to start looking at what roles you want to prioritize and what areas of the business are going to be, kind of the most effective to you. Especially around the infrastructure and things like that. So a lot of businesses nowadays need to focus on things like technology, sales, and any ways to effectively market to their core audience. Along with that, really setting up, the stereotypical answer is the core timelines. So ensuring that your teams are in place. Obviously, it depends from business to business, but, making sure that there's a key strategy in place. And with those difficult roles starting to get in place, ideas of how you're going to approach that. There's so many different avenues that you can take. You can look at nearshore, onshore, you can look at your local market, and then you have to work about the talent shortages that come with that.
It's a really good point, actually. And getting clarity on those roles right at the start is really, really important. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on, actually, in some of the other questions that we've got. But this is, for me, is one of the key reasons why new starters actually drop out within the first 6 to 12 months of starting at any organisation. It's not just startup organisations, is that clarity on the role and what they're expected to do. So that's really important. That's a really good tip. Many startups won't have recruiting resources in place. In fact, some of them don't even have generalist HR skill sets in the business yet. So talent acquisition on demand as a service is now an option which is available and is quite attractive to some. James, can you tell us a little bit about that and why you think that might be a good fit for founders?
It simply plugs that gap. It sounds like the stereotype of coming to the age-old solution that everyone has nowadays of, a subscription service as such, which is, in the most broad stroke what it is. But in basic terms, what it does is allows them to rapidly utilize the resources of an equipped and talented resource and recruitment team to match with the needs that they have as a business and then find the relevant skill set. You hit the nail on the head. Businesses don't necessarily have the skill sets in place or the people in place at that stage. Once you've got your Series A, Series B funding and you're looking to rapidly scale up, there comes a lot of difficulties of actually having the talent to find the proper resources that you need. Utilizing a package where you're not signing a long-term agreement, you're not having to kind of lock yourself in or anything like that, and starting to use for the rapid resources, whilst ultimately, let's be realistic, the business is going to be looking to scale in their own internal team to do that. Essentially, it means that they have an arm of their business, especially for us at TLC. We operate as members of the companies that we work with. We help them with all of the aspects. And that means that instead of having to work with 50 different recruiters and have a very messy process and, like you said, lose a lot of people, they can culturally and kind of internally have a match to directly find that source of whatever they need as quickly as possible.
And obviously, if you use that talent acquisition on demand service, they've got the technology already in place to be able to go after and find that talent. I've used talent on demand services, not just in scale up mode, but also in maintain mode in terms of large organizations. And it's invaluable when it comes to maturing that talent acquisition process and also being able to turn on and turn off when the demand is needed. And the benefit is that you're partnering with a talent acquisition specialist as opposed to using multiple agencies on a contingent basis. So that's certainly a tip there. I would absolutely recommend when you're in that position as a founder. So the other question that is often on people's minds is, when scaling rapidly, how do you balance the need to hire quickly without compromising quality or fit? You've got that investment come in. You need to get those people in to really get that business plan going. But how do you do that without compromising quality and fit?
I suppose I can jump in with a very short answer to that. That's basically what I've spent the last several years specialising solely in that. From my perspective, and obviously my perspective is from the resource side, it's benchmarking and setting the success that you want, setting some realistic goals and timelines, and sometimes that comes with working with your either internal or external teams to understand what a realistic goal is to find the quality hire that you're looking for, but then also working with that and understanding properly what skills, what culture fits you need, what growth potentials you're looking for, and make sure that you have informed decisions to work with. As you said, the technology and the talent pipelines and things like that are key to something like this. So ensuring that when you're actively hiring, you have that realistic goal in place, hopefully means that you're not going to be rushing that process rather than moving towards the goal that you've already set.
Mm-hmm. Very good points. Matt, have you got anything to add on this particular question?
Yeah, I guess coming from a kind of a cultural perspective, just thinking about that idea of culture fit, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I suppose I'd add a bit of word of caution around this notion of cultural fit, because it sounds really attractive and it feels a really important thing, and I totally get why people are drawn to that notion. But I guess there's a slight danger here that we have to be careful about in terms of simply hiring people like us, in the organization. You can end up potentially with really homogenous teams, and potentially, even if you overemphasize the cultural fit piece, you underskill yourself. You don't think carefully enough and clearly enough about the competencies that you are going to need. And often in those early stages, particularly around founder-led organizations where you've got a bunch of friends who've started the organization, it can be really tempting to simply keep drawing in people like you, when actually what you really need to do is start thinking about, well, how do we ensure that we've got the right people in the right roles? And I came across a couple of checks, against this recently, and I like this idea of focusing on values, perhaps, rather than simply culture, because you can have people from very different cultural backgrounds who share really similar values. And so digging a little bit deeper below the superficial, they went to the same kind of school as I did, or same kind of uni, or whatever it might be. It's like, what do they really care about? What really matters to them? So digging a bit deeper, and that might guard against the kind of just confirming our biases, and risking actually not getting the best people for the role.
That's a really good point, Matt, actually, because there's a lot of organisations now that specialise in assessing candidates at the point of recruitment that are actually now starting to focus on values fit. It used to be, let's just do a psychometric test to see whether or not somebody has an IQ. And then we were moving into, well, let's not just look at IQ, let's look at PQ, so the personality side of it. And now it's like, well, hold on a minute, let's just broaden this out. And I think it's a really good way of looking at how do you find like-minded people who are going to walk towards a common purpose together and sharing the same values is a great way of putting it. So we've kind of covered that off in terms of the finding somebody who is going to really come in and fit within the organisation. But what steps can a startup take to ensure that its company culture scales alongside its headcount? Our founders are very particular in terms of the culture that they build, particularly when it's small, and they want to maintain that. And often organisations struggle as it scales to keep those values alive and to keep that culture. So Matt, I'm going to direct this question to you first. What steps can companies take or founders take to make sure that that scales and continues?
Yeah, I guess this sort of picks up on some of the stuff I was saying in the previous point and what you've just said, Jenny, around this idea of moving from a bunch of enthusiastic generalists to needing some specialists, and it might even mean that, you know, people have ended up doing roles that they're not best suited for. So I think one of the really important things that needs to be in place is a transparency and honesty. Communication has to be great, doesn't it? Because we need to be willing to ask ourselves tough questions as an organization. You know, what's needed now? What's needed in this particular moment? It might mean standing a great mate down or someone who's been in there from the beginning to say, actually, this isn't the right role for you anymore. So putting in place I suppose approaches, tools, adopting tools, looking at tools that you can use that are going to enable you to have those difficult conversations where they need to be had, because it can feel unsettling. So processes for making those changes need to be really, really clear. And I guess it sounds really obvious, but often what can happen, I think, in these early stages is there is this rush of enthusiasm, right? We've got this shared purpose and this vision and stuff, and we don't actually stop to ask, well, what do people want to do now that we're growing? Do you still want to do this job? We sort of tell people, and so it's quite top down. So rather than thinking, right, as a leader, I need to know what everybody should be doing, perhaps as a leader, what I should be doing is demonstrating curiosity and asking, what do people want to do? Where are you best placed? So I think that's one key bit. So leading with behavioral expectations where behaviors are an expression of the organization's values. So values often emerge organically, don't they? And so it might be that they're not very clear at the outset, and the behaviors are not very clear. But culture, I guess, is sometimes defined as the way we do things around here. But that takes time to emerge. It's like, well, we haven't been around long enough to have established the way we do things around here. So I thought a great question I heard someone else say, you know, this is a great way of testing your culture. It's, what am I willing to settle for? What are we willing to settle for? And that being your sort of benchmark, and constantly sort of revisiting that, because I guess in startup mode, you can be very focused on the operational. What do we need to do? How are we going to get our next round of investment? And the culture bit gets lost in the urgency, the pressing urgency of the day to day. So it's somehow keeping on revisiting the culture piece alongside those pressing demands of operations.
And as you said, it is something that happens to evolve over time. You know, when an entrepreneur starts out, they don't think, hold on a minute, I'm just going to put a playbook in place to define my company culture and what I want it to be. It's something that naturally evolves, and it is driven because leaders define culture. So as the organization is small, when you've got 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, you've clearly got a figurehead who is driving that culture. Once you start to tip over the 40, 50, 60 people, which is what I call when you're in that scale up mode, it's not just one leader now who's taking that role. And really it's at that point that you want to make sure that those leaders are working together, that management team. And so we'll come on to talk a bit about that later on, because I think that's a really important point. But getting it wrong, what I would say is that if you don't spend the time to be intentional about it, what will happen is that as you scale your headcount, you will see performances impacted and regrettable staff turnover will happen because you haven't spent the time as a leader to define that. And that's really important. You talk, Matt, about what values exist within a culture, and some of that clarity that comes with vision and mission and purpose. We're all human beings, we are driven by purpose, but unless we get that clarity and we're communicating that, something that entrepreneurs often quite find hard to do, it doesn't then flow through. So just thought I'd add those points in.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So that transition going from sort of plus 30, plus 40 people, how Jennie, I'd be interested to hear, how do you preserve as a startup that entrepreneurial spirit, the sort of leanness, the agility? How do you keep that as part of your way of being as you grow?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, and actually one that I get asked a lot by some of the leaders that I coach in that smaller company space. So there's a few points that I would make. Firstly, I would absolutely try and maintain as flat organizational structure as possible, even down to even when you go over 100 people. 200 people, try and keep it as flat as possible, because you want to encourage that open communication in order to get that entrepreneurial spirit. The moment you start sticking hierarchy in, you lose some element of transparency, and that grittiness and that scrappiness that kind of comes with, I can just go and talk to anybody. There's no hierarchy there. It's actually quite a challenge to do, and I've actually got an individual that I'm coaching at the moment who's actually is the HR leader in a company that's going through Scalable, and she's got that challenge at the moment of, well, hold on a minute, because they're asking questions. Employees are asking questions about that career development opportunity. They've been there for a couple of years. What's the next step? And immediately the first thought is, oh, well, I need to put a career structure in. Not necessarily. There are ways in which you can get around that and still allow for growth for individuals, but not actually stick a grading structure in, so to speak. So that's something I would try and not get too overly complex when you look at that. So that's the first one, that flat organisation. The second one is autonomy, and keeping that autonomous sort of feel that you get within entrepreneurial spirit. And empowering your team. So foster a culture of ownership, absolutely, and keep that going, to give that autonomy to innovate, take risks. If people aren't failing, then they're not going to succeed, in my view. You need to, keep looking at that, ensuring that people are staying agile and adaptable as the company grows. I often use something that we use at Giant, which is the support challenge matrix. And that's a very good tool. You can just Google that, but that is a very good tool in which founder entrepreneurs can make sure that they're using it across the business. Where am I on the support challenge matrix? The other thing is, I would say is, and this is linked to the failure point that I made earlier on, but prioritizing that continuous innovation. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And the other thing I find that as organizations grow is they tend to put in more policies, more processes, more bureaucracy, okay? And that will stifle innovation. So keeping it simple and not over complicating things will make sure you keep that entrepreneurial spirit alive. The moment you start putting rigorous processes in, and things like that, then that will stifle it. That's not to say that processes don't have a place, and obviously governance is important, but keep them simple. So those are the sorts of things I would say, Matt.
Yeah, great. And you've mentioned leadership in there. Obviously, leadership is really important in this period of scaling up. So what would you say is the role of the leader in shaping and maintaining that culture during this period of growth?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Leaders are very important, actually. So, and I mentioned earlier on around that founder, obviously, there comes a point in which they are going to have to engage a management team and make sure that their vision for their company is seen through across the whole of the management team. Because although the leader at the top defines the culture and sets that cultural tone, there are subcultures within each of those management layers. So you have to really model what those values and the behaviours that you talked about earlier on, Matt. This is the time when you really need to model what they're going to be. What are the behaviours that you want to see from that management team? It's so important that that's aligned with the mission and as the company grows. And then, of course, then communicating that vision and purpose clearly and making sure that those management and those other leaders can articulate that back. So often have I seen when I've gone into organizations that there is a mismatch between the vision that the founder will explain to me and some of the other managers. And that's not to say that's bad. It's just that, well, it's not to say that they've done anything wrong in that. It's just that there are some joining up that needs to be done in order to make sure that every single management member, however many there are, depending on the size of the organisation, and therefore every single team member within that organisation feels connected to the vision and the purpose. So those are two very clear things. Staying true to the core values, Matt, I'll reiterate what you said earlier on, so important. And that fostering that inclusivity and collaboration, you talked, Matt, earlier on around, it's so important not to recruit clones of yourself, because actually diversity is really, really important when it comes to innovation. So yeah, it's a really good question, Matt. What would you say?
Yeah, I love that bit about diversity leading to innovation. I think that another great question is, rather than saying, do they fit culturally, what can they add culturally? What's the plus here that we've got? Because it absolutely adds value, doesn't it? To have a diverse workforce. Yeah, I mean, I just think this business of creating a language of belonging and connection are really, are useful, I think, here. Daniel Coyle, I don't know whether you've read the Culture Code. If not, it's an absolute must for ideas about how to create a really great working culture. And he talks about the significance of belonging as having a sense of belonging, and that fits in with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All the great psychologists talk about this being a profound human need, and I think we come to work with a much greater expectation that it's going to deliver those things for us as well. And there's a much greater expectation that people will be able to find meaning and purpose through their work as a sort of core thread through their lives. And so being able to create rituals, processes, practices, relatively simple, that enable people to feel like they belong, and creating structures, even the layout of the building, so that there are opportunities for people to bump into one another, to meet one another, to have conversations. And of course, this is a great challenge in a remote working climate, but there are creative ways of doing that. So this point about belonging and opportunities for connection, I think it's really important that leaders build those in. And then I guess the other, and this is talked about a lot, area is just recognizing that as you grow as an organization, you're going to get things wrong. People are going to make mistakes, the leaders included. And if you as a leader can say, yeah, I screwed up here, I made a mistake, take ownership of that and demonstrate that it's okay to admit that you made an error. Because of course, what Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety tells us is that where you have people who are it's really dangerous where you have an organization where people are not able to say they've made an error, because that error just compounds itself, doesn't it? So, and her research, interestingly, was in the field of medicine, where if you have a climate where people can't admit they've made errors, it's literally lethal. And the same is true in an organization, isn't it? So if you're going to be sustainable and healthy and continue to grow, you have to also create a climate of psychological safety. And I really do believe that comes from the top, where you have leaders who are able to be vulnerable, authentic, recognize that they've made mistakes.
Great comments, Matt. And I have read the Culture Code, actually. It's a really, really good book to read. So much so that in a couple of organisations that I've worked with, we've actually produced our own Culture Code that went out to new starters. It went out to any of the recruitment partners that we worked with to make sure that they were recruiting in line with the Culture Code. And it talked about rituals and things like that in it. So James, just on that, because as part of a culture code, you would typically have the mission and the values, the rituals, the behaviours, all those things that Matt's just mentioned. From your perspective, how do you keep new hires aligned with the company's mission and values, especially when we're hiring at speed?
Yes, I think Matt kind of started touching on that a few seconds ago in one of his previous comments, actually. So I'd be interested in his feedback. But from my perspective, it's embedding from the start is the way that I put it. The whole hiring environment and candidate environment and then long-term environment for retaining people has changed so drastically, even in the last few years. Obviously, the remote environment's taken quite a big change to that, and then adding to that, people are not just it's not just package. A business can't just throw a high value package at someone and then expect that will retain the best talent and the commitment to it. People want to be part of a business. People want to be part of that cause, and they want to understand that what they're doing has a form of purpose. Now, that purpose is very different to different people, and that's where, through the start of the hiring process, and like you said, ensuring that your partners and your internal team are aware of what those values are, what your culture is looking to be, and what purpose you have as a business, and then embedding that with the candidates from the start, ensuring that during, or even at interview stage, that you're embedding that philosophy and that idea that they have, and then making sure that through that you're kind of culturally understanding that. It's a very quick way, in my opinion, to work out if someone's interested or not. If someone doesn't align with the business goals, it will become pretty apparent pretty quickly, and then that tends to bleed into retention just as much. So it's vital, in my opinion, at that early stage. I mean, as I said, you kind of touched on that a few seconds ago, Matt. So I mean, what's your perception of that?
Yeah, really, really helpful, James. Thanks. I mean, to flip it around one way, interesting. I mean, I know we're sort of speaking from the hiring end, but it's kind of interesting to think about it from the new employee side of things. And I love this idea that one of the great, what questions do you ask an interview as the new as the applicant? What are the questions I should be asking? Some of the great questions you can be asking, I think, as an applicant are, how do decisions get made around here? Would you describe the leadership in this organization? What do you do when people make a mistake? You can really get under the skin of a culture, and actually, as an applicant, you force hiring teams to be able to articulate the culture of that team. So applicants they can add some spice and some insight and challenge, I think, and that will also, of course, really alert the hirer to the fact that you are interested and concerned about values alignment and culture and how you work. So I think that's just a sort of a slightly different take on it. I guess the other bit is, we've talked a lot about values. It's about consistency, isn't it? If you say you're an organization who does this, we value everybody's opinions, and then in your weekly meetings, 3 people never speak and are never asked to speak, never invited to, pretty quickly, it's not just the people who are not speaking who are probably going to become disengaged, but it's the people who said, but hang on, I thought you said this was an inclusive organization, and you never make an effort to ensure these people are. So, if you're going to say you're a values-led organization, you then have to be consistent in how those are lived out, and then you'll get buy-in, then you'll get engagement, big time as well. I think that's a pretty easy and obvious win. And I think, just lastly, that there's a bit around feedback, I think, too. People want to know early on and quickly. There's this thing about failing fast, isn't there? And failing fast, if you're going to fail fast, you also then need feedback fast. And so being really sure that you have spent time thinking about how you're going to do that, what are your processes, and of course that's a whole nother podcast probably, but this question about building feedback in, I think, is crucial to ensuring you retain employee engagement, you get new hires aligned with mission and vision and values.
Yeah, I suppose you touched on the mistakes and kind of owning up and kind of learning from them. So the one that would lead from that, I suppose, would be in you guys' perception, what are the mistakes that businesses are making when they're trying to rapidly start up, and I suppose more importantly, how do you avoid making those mistakes consistently?
It's a really good question, actually. So, when you think about, let me put it from a hiring perspective. So, actually, when you bring talent in, because it's such an important part for a founder to make sure that they're bringing the right talent in, right? Um, their mistakes can often be, I can sort of summarize them into a few bullet points. So, firstly, that they're actually basing their hires on the immediate needs rather than the long-term fit. So startups often try and fill roles for urgent needs, and they neglect that cultural and strategic fit, which is what we were saying earlier on around it's at that point in time that you do need to map it out. Doesn't have to be a book of everything, but it just needs to bring that clarity. So whoever you're working with gets a clear understanding as to what that cultural and strategic fit needs to be, and making sure that they align with the company's longer term visions, the values that we've been talking about. The other thing is that sometimes you need to bring in a skill that you may not need on a longer term basis. So when you think about the skills that you need when you're trying to hire people in, think about it from, can I acquire that talent, i.e., do I recruit for that talent? Or do I just need to borrow that skill set, i.e., bring a consultant in for a period of time? Or do I need to develop that skill set? Is there somebody in the business already that I can develop and allow an opportunity for growth? So acquire, borrow, develop, and that will help you to not only bring in the right skills, but also retain the people who are loyal by offering opportunities for growth as well, if you think about it that way. So that's number one. The second thing is don't neglect the soft skills element. So when you think about the skills gap that you are looking at, think about it not just in terms of the IQ side of it, the technical skills that you're trying to bring in. Are there any skills gaps on the soft skills basis? We're all diverse. We all have our own voice that we bring. We all have our own strengths. But is there a way in which you can look at that and think about the soft skills that could come in, particularly when you're going from a real startup size into that sort of going from 5-10 people into up to about 50 people? What are the soft skills that you might need? Don't neglect your onboarding and development, because that's so important when you want to bring people in to make sure that they have a structured onboarding program that onboards them into and integrates them into the company. This is a classic error that is made that will cause one of the biggest reasons why people stay or leave. If they do not feel integrated, don't think of it as an onboarding program. Think of it as an integration program. They've got to come in and feel part of that community. They've got to come in and feel part of the team that you've already established. How do you make them feel that way? You have to have a good integration program. And the other thing I would say is, if you suddenly you're a founder and you've got this investment and you're thinking, right, hold on a minute, I cannot do everything myself. The easy mistake to make is to hire too many managers, too many leaders in too quickly. Bringing too many senior leaders, will create a hierarchy issue, particularly for people that have been within the business and used to really just working with the founder. It will potentially stifle the entrepreneurial spirit as well. So I think that startups should certainly balance the leadership hiring with the maintaining of a collaborative, agile environment. And the way in which you can do that is bring in fractional experts rather than hiring in full-time permanents until they're ready to do that. So you've then got the fact, don't get me wrong, the founder should not take everything on. And this is, again, a classic mistake that founders make. Stephen Bartlett talks about this all the time in his series. They do not take everything on, but they can use fractional experts who are for them and with them, but they're not creating that hierarchy within the organization. They're bringing that valuable skill set. And even, dare I say, it will test that knowledge and test that thinking in terms of, is this the right role that needs to come in 6 months, 12 months down the line? And I often see this from a chief people officer perspective. When you go into an organization and think, actually, they don't really need a chief people officer. They need this. They might need a COO, or they might need... Do you see where I'm coming from in terms of that? It's not necessarily one size fits all when it comes to a leadership structure. By far from it. So those are the things that I would say. Matt, have you got anything else to add?
Well, actually, no. I feel like that's such a kind of comprehensive response, Jenny. Thanks. Really, really helpful. And that last piece about there not being a one size fits all, it feels to me really an important one, doesn't it? Because we can sort of think, well, we need X, Y, and Z, and there probably are certain key roles that when you get to a certain size, you really do need to fill. But I guess I would come back to that question. It's like, what is actually in front of you, rather than sort of feeling like there's some playbook you need to be following, I suppose, as an organization. It's like, well, what's actually right in front of me? What are the needs? What are the most presenting needs? And then also just asking yourself and testing yourself, is what is presenting now really the issue? And I guess maybe there's some kind of, we talk about systems thinking, don't we, where we fix a problem in the short term, but actually that's just plastering over the issue. It's not the real root issue. So I think there's really something to be said about patience in the hiring process. Don't rush in. Ask yourself, am I just putting a plaster on the problem, or am I actually dealing with the root cause? And sometimes dealing with the root cause will end up with a very, very different solution. So it might not actually be a hire, for example. I mean, that's just one thing. I mean, the other bit, there's a sort of a follow-on question though here, I think, which is around building a strong employer brand to attract top talent, because here we are, we're talking about what are some of the pitfalls, what are some of the risks, but you are also really wanting to get the best people for the job, aren't you? So how can startups build a strong employer brand to attract top talent? Particularly, I mean, we're in a super competitive market. What advice, James? Perhaps you'd like to kick off on that one.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of touched on that again, actually, Matt, to be fair. So I'm going to repeat your words in some ways, but ultimately, from my side, the key thing I'd say is consistency and authenticity. As you kind of touched on earlier, if a business says that they're doing something and then they're acting in a completely different way, that rapidly comes out. You need your employers and internally to act like it just as much as externally and live by that. Especially when you're looking at the markets nowadays, as we've already said, talent isn't just about the package, it's about the business, it's about having the goals, and they have to understand that they can relate to that presence. They have to see that market is something that they want to be part of, especially when you're talking about the type of people that they're going to be looking for, the top end skilled, the best qualified people. There's going to be more than that to it, so they're going to have a strong presence. They're going to have to properly deliver on what they say. They need to work with their leadership team, going back over all of the kind of the little things that we've said, to ensure that everyone kind of follows that side. Not necessarily having the personality hire that just is the one main face of everything that they say, and rather having a broad spectrum on that, and living to it, being consistent with it, and delivering on it is the way that I'd put it. I'm sure you've got probably a lot more to add on that, Jenny.
Yes, there are 2 points that I want to make on this, which will help to add on to what you've already said. So the first thing is that you want to help candidates visualize themselves in your organization. And I'm going to come on to the second point in a minute around where you are as an organization and how you go and think about that. But the reason why you want to help candidates visualize in the organization is that there is a difference between what we call talent attraction and talent acquisition. Talent attraction is the marketing side. It's before you even start thinking about the acquisition side of the journey, the hiring side of the journey. Any organization should be, their marketing strategy should just have a talent attraction strategy attached to it. You're doing it on social media anyway. How are you building out your followers on LinkedIn, for example, that are not just your client followers, your potential investor followers, but also your potential employees of the future followers? So think about that talent attraction piece being well before you think about your talent acquisition and when you actually start to need hiring. And I go on to my second point, which is you as an organization. Where are you as an organization? There is something called stage fit when you match a candidate to a role. And Matt, this goes back to something that you were saying earlier on when you talked about that potentially founders may have to have that conversation with a friend they have in the organization, where they just, they've been an integral part of that team to this point, but you may need to tap them on the shoulder and say, actually, is it time for you to start thinking about something else? Because there are individuals, and I'm one of these individuals, I know that I'm much more aligned with a company going through scale up. So I specialise in scale up than I would do in going into a massive organisation and being part of an organisation that's already kind of done that journey. Because the stage fit is really important. There are people who are better at being generalists, and there are people that are better at being specialists. That's what they want. So you've got to think about, how do you articulate the stage you are as a company to attract the right talent for the stage that you're in. And don't be afraid to have conversations with them. If you say, look, we're going to be going through a scale up phase, we're going to grow from 50 employees to 600 employees in the space of 2 years. This is what that looks like, right? I know that's quite an ambitious, but it is done. Then you might end up having a conversation with a HR manager who say, yeah, that's great, I'll help you do that. But once you get to, 600 employees, then that's not really where I'm at in my stage fit. So let's just set that up on the table now and be really clear on that. There are other roles as well that will be the same, operating roles and things like that. So those are probably the two things that I would add in terms of building a strong employer talent brand to attract top talent, but attract the right talent at the moment that you're in as an organization. So that was quite a long couple of points, but let's move on to the next question now, because one of the things that is very difficult, and James, I'm sure you hear this a lot in terms of growth, right? People want growth within an organisation, and they want development. And one way in which you can do that is through giving them opportunities to kind of learn from others and things like that. But how do you manage the expectations and development needs of early employees? So those employees that have been with you right from the start, when the company evolves and new talent comes on board. I'm going to direct that to Matt first. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think as you say, what all the research tells us is that people want opportunities for growth when they're in opportunities for development, career development. They want that to be part of the package, and quite rightly, it's really great to maintain momentum, to bring people with you, to create engagement, and because we have got the capacity to learn so much independently as well, we're not in quite the same way dependent on our employer. So your employer is competing with all these other learning opportunities. So in a way, as an employer, as an organisation, you have to make yourselves a really attractive learning forum, if you like. This has to be a place where it's really exciting. There are really exciting opportunities to learn. And I think coming from an educational background and thinking about particularly around adult education, this idea of tailored, bespoke learning is really crucial. So it's setting up some kind of course which you expect everyone to sign up to and just get on with it is just not going to cut it. You have to think about what are the individual needs, and so sitting down, taking time to have one-to-ones. I think those one-to-ones have to be. We have to adopt. The leader has to become a coach in those contexts. It's not enough to say this is what you need to do. The question have to be, what would you like to do? Where would you like to grow? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And then saying, okay, together, how can we co-create some kind of program that is going to help you get there? So I suppose the key elements I would want to focus on are the bespoke, personalized nature of the opportunities for development and the coaching role of the manager or the leader in that particular context.
That's a really, really important point, actually, because it means that that person feels special, because it is tailored towards them, and that brings a sense of togetherness and collaboration at the same time as loyalty. I think the challenge comes, and James, I'm going to come to you in a minute for your views on this, but I think the challenge comes that when you are at the stage you are as an organisation, where you're going through investing in bringing in new talent and new employees, you may not always have that money to be able to go, hold on a minute, I've developed this way, I want a pay rise. That's quite a difficult conversation to have. And you have to get I think you have to get a little bit creative when it comes to those sorts of things. I think nowadays, though, certainly from the research that I've looked at, that people, it's not always about pay anymore. It's about the company, it's about the purpose, the culture, it's about who they're working with. And yes, there is an element of we all need to be able to, back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're not going to work for free, but, because we have got mortgages or whatever, we've got, bills to pay, there is that element of, what else can be offered other than just the financial element when it comes to growth. James, what's your views on this? Because obviously you hear this from a candidate perspective when they're coming in and trying to kind of look at what that journey looks like for them when they're moving into an organisation.
Yeah, I guess I've got a bit of a unique perspective in that as well in some ways, in the sense of I'm also speaking to people that perhaps haven't had what they want delivered internally. When people are looking to move on from an organisation, naturally throughout my career, that's a lot of the people that I've spoke to, those that unfortunately are perhaps not as happy in the career development that they've had, and it gives me, I suppose, a bit of a unique perspective in kind of the consistencies that come up in those people as to what hasn't been delivered. I think there's an overarching message from all of the questions that I'm probably going to have said the same thing, but again, transparency and delivering on what you're saying is key. It goes back to the overarching kind of philosophy of what your business culture is and what your needs are. It's very similar in this sense of if you're going to discuss and have that, be transparent with your staff in what opportunities they have. There's a few things that Matt's mentioned, in regards to, you can do training programs, you can do, kind of specialist courses and working on that. And then there's also, especially in the one of the fantastic things of a startup environment is the adaptability that you have within the business to be able to help people thrive and change. So sometimes you'll find those people that, like we said, that maybe aren't right for the role that they're in at the moment, but they're fantastic in other areas or are, kind of vital to the team as a whole. So helping them thrive just as much is key. That doesn't necessarily mean, specific courses or training. That means giving them the opportunity to be part of those new ventures within the business, to upskill themselves. A lot of people will find the ways and means to skill themselves a lot more nowadays. We're blessed in a lot of ways with social media. You can go onto YouTube and you can find, almost university level educational content for people to upskill themselves within. It's about creating an environment and a management team that will allow people to do that. So working with them to let them do that, and then running true on it. I think one of the biggest things that I can ever say is, if you set that expectation to properly, kind of work with and deliver on that, especially, from recent experience, a lot of founders are always really passionate about that, but then perhaps other things take control and then these things fall to the wayside. And in my opinion, that's probably one of the quickest ways to lose your team and the dedication that they have. If the opportunity and upskill just stops and they become kind of pigeonholed in the role that they're in, they will then naturally and very quickly, in my opinion nowadays, a lot quicker than it used to be, start looking at other opportunities where that potential's there. So ensuring that process is in place is probably one of the most vital things in my opinion.
James, just that point about the agility, that unique position that startups are in to be agile and to sort of create jobs on the fly. And that's, I think, tying that in with the coaching bit is so crucial, isn't it? Because I come back to this point about top-down leadership, which says, right, you're going to do this. But what is great about being in a startup is you can ask your employees, new employees, well, where do you want to be? What would you like to be doing here? And it may be that they come up with an idea that you just simply hadn't thought of. So there's something about letting go and saying, as a leader, I don't have all the answers. We live, we talk about living in a VUCA world. It's volatile, it's changing all the time, and we don't have all the answers. So to be humble enough as a leader to be able to go, what do you think we need? And they may come up with a brilliant answer. And I love that sort of flipping that. And again, in this startup scaling phase, you've still got the kind of capacity to accommodate probably quite often some of those requests.
100%. Yeah, there's no question about that. It's one of the best things that businesses can do. I mean, you're bringing these people in for that exact purpose. You've already gone through a stringent hiring process. You've done the cultural, you've done the personality. This person matches your values. So their opinions and their thoughts sometimes won't always be right, but can definitely lead down avenues that a lot of times businesses haven't even thought of.
I always encourage people to do reverse mentoring. I don't know if you've ever heard of this term before, but this is where, the founder or a senior leader I encourage it across all organizations, will actually ask people who report into them, not directly into them, but even two below, three below, depending on the size of the organization, to do reverse mentoring. It is so insightful. And it's a very good way of a founder to be able to get that feedback, to get those ideas, and to encourage that humility and that transparency that actually they don't know all the answers. So it's a really good one.
I love that point about reverse mentoring, Jenny. It's great, isn't it? Because I talked about sort of humility, but I think there's something there in what you're saying, which also is about sort of being a bit courageous as a leader. Courage is being able to say, I don't have all the answers, isn't it? And that I can learn from new employees who have maybe only been here a day, because they come with sort of a fresh pair of eyes. So building that into the culture, and that is just going to feed up through the culture, isn't it? And create kind of openness and really sort of consolidate this sense of psychological safety. So how, so we're talking about these teams growing, bringing on new employees. And of course, as you said, you don't want to hire too many managers too quickly, but at some point you need a management team. So how can you ensure that they adapt, effectively, in response to a growing context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that aside from having that culture code that we've talked about and everything else, that you need to get the right balance as an organization between what I call your target leadership model, i.e. how do you want your leaders to behave, how do you want them to display the culture and live by the values and everything else, but you need to get that target leadership model and the target operating model in balance. Okay, because and I wouldn't overcomplicate it, but it is around keeping it simple, but it is around the cadences that you want with the operating, and then around how you want that management team to work together and work with their teams, so that you as a founder can do the things that you're meant to be doing at that stage in the business. Because again, you don't want to be getting pulled into things. You've hired a management team to do exactly that, to help you, for you to delegate things to. So what I would say is, in order to get that right, I would say you absolutely need to invest in leadership development together. Now, again, that doesn't have to be costly. It can be combined with other things like time when you've got strategic thinking, when you're doing some strategic planning already. But bringing a development element into it will actually create a common language that you can talk about, encourage that vulnerability, Matt, that you were mentioning earlier on around, everyone learns. You don't graduate from the school of self-learning. You never graduate from the school of self-learning, and you need to be able to be authentic and vulnerable in that, I think. So combine those together so that you're not taking up too much time, but you are spending that time together to do that. The second thing is promote that growth mindset with your management team. We've talked about this already, the failing aspect of it. Matt, I loved your question earlier on that candidates can ask, what do you do in this company if somebody makes a mistake or something like that? I think that's great, but you need to promote that growth mindset. The support challenge matrix I mentioned earlier on, to bring the right support and challenge into that management team, is really critical. There's no point in talking about leadership tools and things that you might want to adopt in your management team unless you're actually bringing those leadership tools into your own conversations. So not bringing enough So I'll give you an example. Often I see entrepreneurs go into this, what we call the protect mode, where they don't bring enough challenge to that management team. And that's largely because, founders will tend to have in their mind their vision, what they want. And if they don't bring the right challenge and make others accountable for it, they'll end up doing it themselves. Okay. So they need to be able to make sure that they're bringing that right challenge in order to avoid going into the protect mode. So that's an example of where I've seen that happen. And that's just by nature of it's the founder's business. They're very protective anyway. And as the company grows, so does the need for management structure. So this is the last point that I want to make in ensuring that as your management, as the company grows, as your management team expands, how can you make sure that you effectively scale as an organization? As the company grows, the management structure will grow. And this is when founders need to be able to put a business head on. I know sometimes it's very, very difficult to do, and have conversations with individuals when they are no longer at the right stage fit. I talked about this earlier on. That's so important with management teams. The moment you stop doing that, you don't bring in the right management skill for the stage fit of the organization, and it will stifle your performance, guaranteed. And so that's just my final point to make on that.
Yeah, I suppose there's something there, isn't there, Jenny, about that. You talk about this importance of putting in structures in place over time, and because you can have a great culture, everyone's really nice to each other, but without the structure, you have this sort of comfortable chaos. Don't you? It's like it's all very nice, but there's nothing really holding the organization, and then if you don't have the leadership piece as well, people don't really know where they're going. So those three pieces sort of are feeding into one another, aren't they? As where are we headed, how are we getting there, and what do we need, the structures that we need in place? And that's where the management piece becomes so crucial, doesn't it? Which maybe in those early heady days of startup doesn't feel so important. I mean, I guess I'd add a couple of things, perhaps, if I may. One is this idea of, teams who are the leadership teams, the management teams. When you're operating as a team, what is essential to a team functioning well is the individuals in that team being self-aware, knowing themselves. There's a reason that Socrates saying, know thyself, has stood the test of time. And at Giant, we have a know yourself to lead yourself tool. This idea that we've got, if we're going to lead, we have to understand our weaknesses, our strengths, where we need to grow, what we look like on a good day, what we look like on a bad day, what we look like when we're under stress. I've got to be aware of that stuff, because if I'm not, I'm going to come unstuck, and no team is going to function well without sort of a deep self-awareness. So putting things in place that can help teams become self-aware, I think, is a really important part. And that may not be immediately, but that's something that I think is crucial, that gets built into an organization as it grows. And then I guess the second bit is a management team being able to upskill themselves so that they can have conversations about conversations. And what I mean by that is, you're in a meeting and a decision keeps getting stalled, and it's like, we need to have a conversation about why we're not making this decision. What is happening? What's stopping us from making this decision? Or I've noticed that every time so-and-so speaks, everyone just ignores them and moves on. What's going on there? So this kind of meta conversation about what's happening in the room, that takes time again, but those are the kinds of things which you can start practicing pretty early on, but I think are essential ingredients for long-term success of any organization.
It's a really good point, actually, in terms of getting that management team functioning really well together to be able to have what I call those adult conversations. Now, we could carry on talking about this for hours, it seems, but we are going to have to draw this podcast to a close. I'm going to bring our listeners and viewers back to something that Carey Smith said earlier on. Often or not, when we're a founder, and hopefully you've got some really good insights from this particular podcast today around how you think about your people and scale your talent and think about your culture. Use your network to be able to talk things through. This is what Carey said in a previous podcast, because you don't necessarily have to have me as an an expert in CHR, as a CHRO, Matt in organisational development, or James as an expert in talent acquisition, in your business to be able to get the answers that you need to take your business forward. Do use your network and get some ideas from that, because hopefully that will give you, as a founder, where you are at the moment, the opportunity to just think slightly differently about the way in which you're leading your business and how you scale it. So thank you very much, Matt and James, for joining today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope our listeners have too.
Real pleasure, Jenny and James. Enjoyed it
Thank
very
you.
much as well.